I will ask I will ask our colleagues from the next sequence of the panel to join us. So Sandra, could you please help me? So Galina Grigorenko, thank you for joining us. Please, Galina, have a seat. Vice Minister of Culture of Ukraine. I will also ask Loretta Iber-Girardet to join me, please, on my right. My dear friend Krista Picat, have a seat, Krista. And Martin Jaggi. Martin, where are you? So maybe over there, you could sit over there. Okay, so now we will go to Ukraine for a couple of minutes. Galina, you have been one of the person the most involved in your country for the protection of cultural heritage. You have been working for the Ministry of Culture. You have also worked for some NGOs. So we have worked with you very closely. You are a key person for cultural heritage protection in Ukraine. So my first question was, when it happened, how did you define your strategy? How did you react when there were outbreak?
Well, thank you very much for invitation to have an opportunity to speak here to this distinguished audience. Since the start of the invasion, because the war actually started in 2014 and we are now in 11th year of the war, when the full-scale invasion started, the first priority was, of course, protection of what we can protect. Unfortunately, we cannot build shields over the buildings, over the archaeological sites. What we can do is evacuation of museum collections, and as we speak now, probably Ukraine has faced unprecedented since World War II amounts of evacuated museum collections, because now it amounted to 600,000 evacuated from museums from eastern part of Ukraine to the western part of Ukraine. But of course, evacuation could not happen before the martial law was established. Unfortunately, we cannot do this beforehand, though we were expecting the invasion. We cannot start evacuation in all the legal procedures which is written in our laws. So unfortunately, many museums remained on occupied territories, and we do not have any information about museums in Mariupol, in Kam'yana Mohyla, in different cities of Donetsk and Luhansk region. Unfortunately, this is probably the most challenging task for us, how to retrieve this information based on our information on registry books in museums, and then following them on some open sources data to have arguments to claim them back at some point. Another one challenge is, of course, stabilization of damaged buildings of cultural heritage sites, because in Ukraine we have 130,000 of cultural heritage sites. We are a big country. And at of 25th of April, we have monthly statistics gathered from our local administration and regional administrations. It's 1,453 objects were damaged or totally ruined. That means more than 1%. Unfortunately, we cannot protect them beforehand. We can only stabilize in case if they were damaged, and to prevent their further deterioration. And in this regard, of course, we very much appreciate support from our international partners with ALIF, with UNESCO, with World Monument Fund, because this allows us to react swiftly and systematically to stabilize these buildings. Because when we are talking about expenses from state budget or from local budget, it's a project which will never end. Now all the expenses prioritized for the military, purposes, and that means that all expenses for cultural heritage protection at the end of the list, if we will have enough money. So that means that we cannot react swiftly and rapidly. So with the help of our international partner, that was possible, actually. And if we are talking about strategical approach, because we started actually this coordination platform between partners and donors at the end of 2022 with support of ALIF actually and UNESCO. We developed an action plan where we prioritized 6 main areas of our attention, how we can move forward, because we understand that the urgency of first month of invasion should be substituted with more strategic approach. So now we are adopted a strategy for culture. That's the first strategy for culture in Ukraine ever since our independence in 1991. And one of the strategic goals in this strategy tells us that protection of cultural heritage, tangible, intangible, movable, it's the priority for the country. It's not only a task for the ministry, it's priority for different stakeholders, and of course responsible for protection of local cultural heritage is including local authorities, regional administration and ministerial level, and different ministries as well. So at this moment, we are talking about building this strategic approach of how to protect in any case, because we understand that the war is not over. And unfortunately, even with ceasefire, we will be still under threat of invasion, of further invasion and attacks from Russian Federation. And now as we speak, there is a 4th air alarm in Kyiv. I follow it in my phone because my family in Kyiv, and I should be every minute to understand what's going on, and that means that we need to be protected, and we need to have preventive measures to be prepared for future. So that means that this strategy should involve civil protection, where cultural heritage protection is an integral part. And that means that, of course, prioritization for this should be done from the local level to the national level in every stakeholders interaction, etc., etc. Because, as General mentioned, when the evacuation from some museums taking place, that means that museum workers, local administration, national police, national guard are following it. And of course, it's done not with media attention. Of course, it's done sometimes even in the night. And during the martial law, we have curfew time in the night, so it's additional challenges for us. But anyway, we need to develop this strategy further, because, for example, now we have shortage of storages for museum collections, because another 3 million objects are still closer to the front lines, and we need to evacuate them from. And that means we need to re-equip some basements, some depots, some storages for further needs. And we understand that after the ceasefire will come and some more or less stable condition we will face, we need to restore everything which was wrapped in a hurry, which is stored in some basements, often not in the optimal conditions, and that means that we need to restore a lot of objects, wooden, paintings, glass, paper, etc., etc. So now our task, first of all, is to plan strategically and to develop this system of interaction, though it's written in our laws, but unfortunately without trainings, without really preparedness in every minute, without, I don't know, false alarms, just to train people, that's not possible. When it's only on paper, it's not working. So our task is to prepare strategically for any circumstances we will face, either it's climatic changes, either it's natural disaster or war.
So coordination is key, but also very complicated, because you need people to do it, you need time and so on. So did you accept that some things could be done without your approval, without your coordination? Or did you have in mind the necessity to coordinate everything?
Well, decentralization process in Ukraine, which have taken place for 10 years now, it allows me to say that a lot of efforts could be done on horizontal level. It shouldn't be coordinated, centralized vertically, but for some challenges, we should, of course, be coordinated. And from the very beginning of the invasion, a lot of chaos was happening. A lot of people just didn't know what to do, how to react, what the first priority should be. Some of people remained at their museums, for example, with their collections. Some people have flee the country, so that was a chaos. And probably a month or two after the start of the invasion, it was totally, not totally, but at some point unpredictable what will happen. But then a lot of NGOs, a lot of civil society organizations started to react really promptly and swiftly, establishing contacts with international organizations, international partners, asking for help. And I'm very grateful that international partners did not wait for approval from the ministry, because it's very important that they react quickly on this horizontal level. And when we have like the whole picture, we can understand where there are duplications or there are gaps. So this coordination, of course, is needed, but mostly for exchange of information, not official approvals or something. But when we are talking about, for example, building a depository for museum objects in Ukraine, of course, it's a task for the ministry, for the government, for the state. It's not up to NGOs which are advocating that this is necessary, but it's our task to claim that where it should be built, that should be a network of these regional depositories in different regions of Ukraine, not just one, because it's also not optimal to store it in one place. So there are different challenges which should be coordinated differently. And this approach, agile approach to problem solving, is probably one of the strengths of Ukrainian society, because we are allowing to take responsibility to those who are willing to take this responsibility on,
Are there other advice that you could give to people who have to protect their cultural heritage in the midst of a crisis or a conflict? Any other ideas? Oh, sorry. So do you have some advice to give to people who protect cultural heritage in the midst of a crisis or a conflict? A few advice, very, very short.
To civil society organizations? Or
I mean, to everyone. What for you, what are the 3 key elements of the right management of a crisis?
That's my view, my personal view. But
yes.
First of all, it's to allow taking responsibility to those who is capable of bearing this responsibility, first of all. Then exchange information, regular exchange information, because otherwise we cannot build trust, we cannot build long-term planning. And the third thing probably is transparency. Of course, reporting to the society what's going on, it's important. And it's important also to acknowledge the efforts of protection of cultural heritage, because unfortunately in Ukraine, cultural heritage was viewed before the war mostly as a burden. Some heavy suitcase which you should carry, you should invest some money to protect it, but there is no inputs and benefits for your society, for your local community from it. And now it's changing. It's changing really rapidly, because everyone in the country understood all of a sudden that the reason for this war is culture, is identity. That's what different between us and Russian. That's our roots, that's our tradition, that's our built heritage, that's our museum collection, and that's why this war is happening. That's actually existential war. They're claiming that Ukrainians are just wrong Russians, and to tell people why we are different, we need cultural heritage as a proof that we have long history, and we are not invented by Lenin in 20th century. We have a long history of our country. So that understanding comes all of a sudden for the whole society, and that's on the one hand a benefit of this war and how we can move forward with this acknowledgement of cultural heritage by the white society.
Thank you. So cultural heritage is a political issue, and cultural heritage is not the cherry on the cake. So you are right. So Loretta, if I may. So Loretta, you are based in where are you based actually?
Across the street.
Okay. In Geneva. So you are one of this organization, of the part of the Geneva International.
Absolutely.
So maybe you could say a few words before we move on to the deep discussion of your organization. What do you do?
So first of all, thank you very much for being here. I am from the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. We are a small part of the UN Secretariat, and our main responsibility is to help countries put in place the policies and programmings needed to reduce disaster risk. We are custodian of a 2030 agenda called the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. And we're very closely linked to the work underway right now with climate change and climate change adaptation. So we are based in the World Meteorological Organization, and we are basically focused on how do we reduce disaster risk and the impacts of disasters on countries and societies.
Okay, thank you very much. I apologize. You know, I'm always in conflict areas, so that I don't spend so much time in Geneva, to be honest. But so, what are the key concepts and approaches to disaster preparedness today that could inspire the cultural heritage sector?
Well, I'm really glad to be here today because we are seeing that climate-related disasters now account for about 90% of disasters from natural hazards in countries. And of course, it's only getting worse. We're seeing more frequent, more intense disasters, floods, but also extreme heat. And I think one of the very first things in order to protect cultural heritage is to understand the changing climate and what the impact of a changing climate means for cultural heritage. I've mentioned floods, but we are now seeing a rapid increase in extreme heat. So what does this actually mean for cultural assets? And do we understand the impact of a changing climate on cultural heritage? So that's the very first thing. Really being involved in understanding climate change impacts. The second thing, though, is to understand where are cultural heritage assets and are they included in countries' and cities' risk assessments. And I fear that that's not always the case. Even when we do multi-hazard risk assessments to try to understand which neighborhoods, which populations are most exposed to disaster risk, we're not systematically looking at cultural heritage sites. And I think that's something that would be extremely important to start changing, because if we don't really document where these cultural heritage assets are, we will not be able to take the type of measures that are needed to protect them when a disaster strikes. However, I wouldn't necessarily recommend standalone cultural heritage disaster planning. It's really important to look at how do you bring this into a country's disaster risk management planning. There are really good examples out there. So we are seeing movement in this front, where we are seeing more and more cultural heritage, I would say, representatives engaged in national disaster risk management platforms, but probably not enough. And I think this is an area where we could really start to work closer together. There are opportunities with AI, for example. Right now, we're able to model potential impacts of disasters, and cultural heritage could be one of the elements that we bring into it. Countries are increasing simulations exercises to understand potential risks, and this is also an opportunity to really bring in cultural heritage, to simulate, for example, the evacuation of assets from museums. So many opportunities. The other thing that I would mention is I believe it's important to also look at the legal frameworks and to ensure that cultural heritage is included into disaster management laws. And we do have some good examples of that. For example, in Bangladesh, it is a legal requirement that archaeological sites are included into disaster management strategies. There are a few countries such as Ireland, for example, which has a very clear component on cultural heritage as part of its national adaptation planning. Japan has a comprehensive risk management planning that also includes mandatory protection of shrines and other sorts of cultural heritage sites. So there are good examples. I think documenting these examples, but also seeing where there are gaps. I can give the example of Athens that developed a resilience strategy up to 2030. And upon review by the British Council, as a matter of fact, it was determined that the cultural heritage assets in the city's planning wasn't robust enough. And so then the city undertook a review, and it therefore, increased its focus on cultural heritage. So those are a few of the things that I could recommend, but I also think we should remember that cultural heritage and culture in general can be a real asset in trying to build resilience. So it's not just cultural heritage as a vulnerable component, but also as a way that really it can help build awareness of risk, disaster risk in communities. We have good examples of this, but also as an asset, as a real tool to build resilience. The other point I maybe would just mention is recovery. I would really recommend that cultural heritage be part of pre-disaster recovery planning. It's not often at the forefront of this, I would say, but that we use post-disaster events as an opportunity to really build back better and to build resilience into cultural heritage using obviously technology that may exist, but also the non-technological solutions. So for example, we are involved in a global effort to increase early warning systems in countries. And really trying to promote indigenous knowledge as part of that, and really trying to understand, the cultural components of populations understanding disaster risk and acting on them. So I see many opportunities there as well. Maybe one thing I would just add is that we do track loss and damage to cultural heritage. We have a disaster loss and damage tracking system that we use, but unfortunately, less than half the countries, and these are official government statistics, less than half the countries are actually tracking losses and damages to cultural heritage. So I think with the big focus right now in the global climate community on loss and damage, there's a real opportunity for those who are working in the cultural heritage sphere to work closer and to start encouraging countries to collect official statistics on losses and damage to cultural heritage. Because when you have the official statistics and you're able to see the losses and damages that are occurring, economic but also non-economic losses, you're better able to integrate it into disaster risk management planning. Excuse me.
Thank you, Loretta. You convinced me to cross the street. No, thank you very much. It's very interesting, and we are at your disposal to see how we can work together and to see how we can strengthen the place and the role of cultural heritage protection in this emergency crisis strategy. Krista. So Irina mentioned this morning that it's key to work with local players, and I know that you work a lot with local players and you do your best to work with them. So how do you work with them on preparedness strategies and in the midst of a crisis? How UNESCO, which is a huge international organization, work with local actors on the ground?
Good morning to everybody. I think that we mostly draw on what we call UNESCO family, to which I hope we can also count also on Alif. UNESCO is a UN intergovernmental organization, but we have always thought that we have a comparative advantage vis-à-vis the other UN agencies because we have these networks. First of all, we have national commissions. So in every country, we have a national commission where representatives of the civil society, academia, and other institutions in the field of UNESCO's competence are represented. We also have institutes, category 2 centers, UNESCO chairs, associated schools. So UNESCO is much more than just an intergovernmental organization. And I think this is also what we draw on as we deliver our operational programs. Of course, we also have presence in the countries. And I'm very happy also to see that through these field offices, we have managed to forge partnerships, not only with governments, but also with the civil society organizations. The other advantage we have is the expert community, and many of you are here, part of this network that we take pride of. These are, the local experts of ICOM, ICOMOS, IUCN, all the people with whom we work and who actually are the UNESCO ambassadors, I could say, and we call when something happens in the country to get information and put in place what needs to be done. So of course I think there is an increasing recognition also within UNESCO, and I was also double checking this with Francesco whether my understanding was correct yesterday, because for instance when you look at our legal instruments, especially the first legal instruments of UNESCO, the Hague Convention, the 1972 Convention, have very little mention of civil society actors. And Francesco confirmed to me that in the 1972 Convention, the communities are only mentioned as beneficiaries. Whereas I think now the international understanding of the importance of communities has grown to such extent that not only we have conventions like the Intangible Heritage Convention that very much is based and anchored in the communities, but also that under Francesco's leadership, the 1972 Convention also realized that the communities and the know-how, the ownership, the agility that they can bring to bear is important also in the protection of World Heritage sites.
So, thank you. So what could be done to improve the emergency response of international actors like you and us to crisis?
I would very much want to echo actually what Madame Bokova said in the first panel, and what has been said also in the previous discussions with our Lebanese friends. And also refer back to the meeting that UNESCO convened last September, where we asked our partners to come, and we had the discussion on how we can improve our delivery. Because I think that we all recognize that no actor can do this alone. And we need complementarities, we need multilateralism, and that each of us can bring to bear a specific skill set or comparative advantage. What ALIPH does, UNESCO can't do, and vice versa. So that's why we need each other. So it's really an effort between the different stakeholders. The civil society organizations, and Galina also mentioned that, were there when the full-scale invasion of Ukraine started. And they were also perhaps, the very important interlocutors of many of the international actors. Yet, I think what is important is that there is always this ownership of the ministry. There are standards that are set, so that, for instance, when there are international actors that support the development of inventories, that in the end of the day, these data sets speak to each other, that the country has the data and they have the ownership. So, and that's why each of us has to play our role. I also want to mention the importance of the on the one hand, the advocacy, and I'm happy to also see my colleague from UNDRR here. We have also followed up on the need for the culture to be more integrated in disaster risk reduction, humanitarian situations. We have had discussions with OCHA, UNHCR, to see how we can brief those colleagues who are there in the humanitarian situations, so that they also bring to their strategies the cultural dimension. And we have agreed that we will do more briefings so that they are sensitive to the importance. Because when we speak about humanitarian circumstances, we all recognize that it's about saving lives, it's about people. But when we speak about people, we speak about culture. because we all carry this intangible heritage with us. And it's in particular important in situations of emergency. So I think that there's also a growing understanding of this importance. But it's also the strengthening of our legal frameworks. And here I would like to pay tribute also to the Hague Convention. And a little bit contradicts what my dear friend and colleague Francesco said earlier, because we were celebrating last year the 70th anniversary of the Hague Convention. And I think that what we realized in this framework was actually that this convention is still very, very much important. We see that there is a kind of new wave of recognition that this legal instrument that was developed in the wake of the Second World War, and that they, you know, for many decades was somehow thought that there's something, you know, we put on the shelf and didn't have to think of. Now Ukraine comes us and says, okay, how can we use these modalities? Lebanon, when they had the war or the attacks on their heritage, they came to UNESCO and said, okay, how can we use the 1954 convention and put 34 sites on the enhanced protection list under the Hague Convention. Next week we are convening, as I mentioned yesterday, the Civil Military Alliance Forum. This is how we will be looking at how we can work better with the military. How can we make sure that you know, all hands are on deck, because we need everybody and we need to enhance this cooperation.
Thank you, Christa. So, Martin, if I may. So you are, Martin, you are the Chief of Staff, Swiss Humanitarian Head of the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation. So do you, I will go straight to the point, do you integrate cultural heritage protection in your mission in humanitarian aid, the Swiss humanitarian aid? And if not, why?
You hear me?
Yeah,
yes. Okay. I wouldn't say much. Probably it's a subject or an item that the humanitarians in general, they are not working a lot on it. That's my observation. I've been working now for humanitarian aid for 22 years in different contexts in Angola, Colombia, Peru, all over the world, in Sudan, etc. So it's really not a subject that is at the heart of humanitarian affairs, I have to say. We have been working a little bit on it, as I said, in the past in Cambodia, more in the reconstruction part of humanitarian affairs. But we wanted also to install somehow expertise for rapid response missions. This was in 2008, so a long time ago already, but it never was implemented. So also to be ready when a disaster is striking, that we can integrate cultural heritage preservation into our action, but it has never been implemented. So we are a little bit in reconstruction sometimes. We got also, I think, in Ukraine, we got once a couple of years ago now already a request to support there. We did some first missions, but it never went further on. So I would say in general, and why is that? Because it's not regarded as a life-saving action. And humanitarian affairs normally, when it comes to response after the disaster, is focusing on people, but less on culture as such. So I think it should be probably regarded much more as also a life-saving activity. But in these times of financial cuts, it's very cumbersome. It's very difficult. The whole UN system is in a huge reshape now due to the financial cuts also of the US, and we know the needs are growing. So it's probably not the best moment, or probably yet it's a good idea now when the UN is restructuring also to think how to better integrate cultural affairs into humanitarian response, reconstruction, or even prevention and preparedness. Anyway, we'll have to deal with it, but probably this subject has to be taken more into account, I would say.
So I hope that you will be convinced after all this panel session and by the end of the day. So how do you, at your level, how do you coordinate humanitarian aid and the different sector of humanitarian aid when you intervene in a country in crisis? How, for instance, how do you how do you define the priority when you go to a country, when you want to help it facing the crisis? How do you coordinate the different sectors?
Yeah, well, the UN has a cluster coordination system, which is on the review as well as now, so we don't know how it will work afterwards, but at this very moment, so there are 11 clusters, but cultural affairs or culture as such is not a cluster. So it should be mainstreamed as in the jargon of the UN or the humanitarians, but it's not something that is systematically tackled so far. But it could be, of course, or it should be, and sometimes probably it is also integrated in the different clusters. In protection, certainly, because it's not just about the items that have to be protected, cultural items, but also, as we heard, the languages, etc. So people are very, very important. So, and protection is one of the clusters that is important in the coordination system. And I suppose that there is a good entry, or should be a good entry point to work more on cultural heritage. So the UN cluster system, and then of course we could also think, you know, on as we heard it also before, just to send specialized teams. Right after a disaster like now in Myanmar, to take care of the heritage that, or to support governments or civil society organizations of sites that have been destroyed. But I think it's still very weak as well. Yeah.
Okay. So what preparation and response strategies have been the most effective to you the last few years? At your position, and are there sectors where it works better than others?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's a little bit a summary of what we heard this morning. Different points when we go into prevention and preparedness. There are a couple of things that have been mentioned, that there have been a legal basis. We heard from Gilles Carbonnet from the ICRC that legally, at least, there is, with the Geneva Convention, we do have legal basis. It's not perfect also, as we heard, but at least there is, and it may constitute a crime of war if you attack sites, etc., so cultural sites. So there's a basis. Probably it has, we have to work on this, but this is certainly important at the global level and also at the national level. So the legal stuff is very important, and then also the planning, the preparedness plans that have to be done before a crisis or is showing up. Inventories, all this, we heard different types of doing the inventories, etc. And then the training, capacity building, and last but not least, I think in that regard, taking into account the communities, so the local actors, which we also heard, this is very important, I would say. This is in terms more in the preparation, and then when the disaster or a war is striking, of course, we also, Ukraine has a very, very now sound experience, of course. Unfortunately, there are other countries probably they're struggling even more, like Sudan, or also, you know, if you think about the Gaza Strip, etc. So the huge challenges around all over the world due to the wars. And there, of course, you can't do so much. Try to preserve a little bit, protect the people, preserve sites, do some surgery work, but sometimes it's not possible. And then prepare for reconstruction. I think this is very much important, and this needs the whole of the community. It's not just the humanitarian affairs, of course, but it's very important that development actors are getting in. Military, we have here is very important also. Of course, the peace building actors in that sense, private sector, civil society, government actors, etc. So it's a very complex issue. It sounds quite simple. And culturally, in my opinion, we always say it's very important for the identity, etc. But it never gets, for some of the other reasons, really the attention it should get. Yeah, thank you.
So a lot of work. Before we move on to the question from the audience, any other comments on your side, Galina, Krista? No. So questions. Please. Please introduce yourself very briefly and ask your question.
Thank you very much for this interesting discussion. I am Isra Al-Ghadi from Sudan, and I'm representing Resurgence and leading the Raja program in Sudan. So my question is for Loretta. since we are working in the same field. We are currently implementing Daraja, which is mainly about accessing and easing the access of early warnings and weather and climate information to conflict-imposed communities in Sudan. And we conducted a research study that covered about over 2,000 household surveys in different segments of the communities, which was great achievement during this conflict. Interestingly, one of the key results that over 80% of the respondents, they depend on traditional methods and indigenous knowledge in weather forecasting and weather predictions. In this and in our intervention, we really think of marrying the scientific ways of predicting methods and also the traditional knowledge of the communities, because they do own it. I want to ask, what are the current initiatives that adopting this in strengthening the resilience of communities through indigenous knowledge in the MENA region and in Sudan specifically? And if we can join forces together, because we are in the middle of the implementation and preparing for the rainy season, inshallah. And the other question is, knowing that the UNDRR works with the DRM authorities in the countries, so what other ways that the UNDRR are adopting to include CBOs and CSOs, as they are those who work with the community and those who reach the last mile? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for the question. And maybe we can speak a little bit afterwards as well. Sudan is one of the countries which has lost its actual forecasting capacity because of the conflict, and the meteorological institution lost its capacity. But having said that, it is currently being supported by the government of Netherlands to strengthen its early warning system, and is exactly as you say, because of the situation in the country, it has to rely on local approaches rather than a whole nationwide system. It's just developed a national early warning roadmap strategy. And within that, there is an emphasis on traditional and local knowledge. And we have many good examples. I'm thinking of Indonesia, for example, during the Sulawesi earthquake, where we saw that those communities that relied on their local knowledge around earthquake threats were able to save lives much better than those that relied on traditional, I would say, technology-based approaches, because the system had failed. So we have been promoting indigenous and traditional knowledge as part of the Early Warnings for All initiative, which was launched by the Secretary General 3 years ago to provide early warning to all countries, to all communities by 2027. And in particular, it's part of Pillar 1 of early warning, which is on risk knowledge. And there we've been encouraging all countries to tap into representatives of indigenous and local groups to look at what are the systems that are currently in place and how do you expand and how do you train people on this. So you raise a really important point. We've become too reliant on technology that can fail during disasters, and really tapping into local action and local knowledge has been key. But I'm happy to share more with you because we've done a lot of research on this and we have some tools that may be beneficial for you.
Thank you. So another point we could talk about together, because we do think at ALIF that it's very key to work on traditional knowledge, and they can be part of the solution. Any other questions? Madam.
Hello, I am Alexander Zampaki.
Microphone.
Hello, I am Alexander Zampaki, the UN Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights. And it's very interesting that I heard during the whole day a lot about cultural identity, but not cultural rights. So that's something to come maybe later when I talk. But what I want to talk about is, how do you ensure cultural diversity and the protection of cultural diversity when you come out of a war, and especially when it comes, this cultural diversity also includes the aggressor's cultural identity. This must be very difficult, and I was wondering whether there are discussions and steps ongoing at the moment about this. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Of course, it's a challenging situation. Of course, now we are facing not problems, but challenges for people displaced even within Ukraine, national minorities and people who trying to keep their identity and right to cultural expression of their local communities when they're displaced, all over the country. When Mariupol is occupied, they are living in all regions of Ukraine, but it's not a surprise, but how they use modern technology to gather people, So they have this digital communities and exchanging knowledge, and we are trying to provide spaces and to provide possibility, for example, for Mariupol Museum, which is redone exhibition of Easter eggs, Pisanka, which is intangible heritage, representative list of UNESCO, made by Greek national minorities over Mariupol region, and they recreated this lost collection because the museum was totally damaged, presented it in Kyiv, for example. So now we are facing these challenges even during the war. Of course, when we are talking about protection of cultural rights of Russian people in Ukraine, I should say that they never was under pressure or anything which is claimed by Russia when they are invading to protect Russian people. But at the same time, of course, we should, differentiate between manipulation and trying to keep right to self-expression to those people. Of course, every national minority in Ukraine have their own right to have local festivals, to have local art, traditionals, and printing books, for example, in their language, having part of the airtime in local media or in public broadcaster media. So everything should be, balanced. And even after the victory, ceasefire, how do we call it? I don't know what we will face. But anyway, it's our obligation to give similar rights to every people in Ukraine who choose to be Ukrainian political nation. Any origin, any nationality, but if they choose to live in Ukraine and to be citizen of Ukraine and to be part of our political nation and trying to build future of this country, of course they will be given their right to express themselves in their own way, in their own tradition, and speak in their language. That's a general approach of Ukrainian state, and in the way of Euro integration, that's one of our obligations. So we cannot stop trying and preventing people to express themselves, even if this is representatives of the Russian culture, not Russian Federation, Russian culture.
Thank you, Galina. I think that unfortunately we have to stop. Thank you to the panelists for this discussion, and thank you, Ali, for the organization.